my innocence. I slept in this nursery. I stared out this window at the orchard. I woke up happy every morning. It looked exactly the same then. Nothing's changed. All white. Oh, my orchard. After the dark and dank autumn and cold, cold winter.
Yes, a cold, cold winter. Have you had enough of that yet? But we're here not to talk about the weather. We're here to talk about the winter or the weather. We're here to talk about genre. Though genre is like the weather. You always have it, right? It's not like you never have weather. You always have, or you ever not have weather. You always have some kind of weather. Even when there seems to be no weather, we say it's just calm. It's like that with genre as well. There's always a genre operating, right? To structure our expectations as we go about reading a text. We walk up to a poem, we say, that's a poem. And all of a sudden we're reading it in a certain way that we wouldn't read it if we said, that's a novel, right? And this is something that Fowler gets into in his difficult and abstract essay that I wanted you to have a stab at, take a stab at anyway. Fowler calls our attention to modern concepts of meaning, such as Dan Sperber and Deidre Wilson's theory of relevance. As Sperber and Wilson have made very clear, Fowler writes, coding and decoding, and that must include generic codes, play only a limited part in communication and interpretation, which are largely a matter of small-scale inferences guided by relevance. The principle of relevance, which is a rather abstract concept that he introduces, operates at every stage. In the case of literary interpretation, relevance must necessarily be to readers' own cognitive environments, even to their own interests. But, and this is an important but whether they know it or not, they're also continually guided by relevance to what they assume to be the writer's intention. Now, those writer's intentions include genre. Like, what is the writer intending to create here? Is it a poem? Is it a play, a drama? Is it an epic? Is it a narrative? Is it a novel? Is it a short story? And so on. He says parenthetically, these promise, after all, the pleasure of recognizing intended harmonies. And you do get this sense of satisfaction. I suppose it's a form of pleasure that you get when you look at a poem and you recognize perhaps the rhyme scheme, and you realize this is a poem. It's a poem that has a rhyme scheme, one of these recognizable rhyme schemes, like a sonnet. We're going to be talking about sonnets. Generic organization, Fowler continues, may be conjectured to facilitate interpretative inferences at almost every level of structure. And we're going to see some examples of, at a very small level of structure, the individual tiny little micro episode, we see genre operating in such a way as to provide some guidance for us, right? As we go about attempting to apprehend or comprehend the play. The point here is that, to try to pierce through the abstraction a bit, the point here for Fowler's making, and not just Fowler, is that we read a work, as we read a work, our individual interests tend to take a backseat at some point to the interest, so to speak, of the genre of that work, the genre that we decide was intended by the author. Our own individual interests matter little often when we try to make sense of the elements of the work. Genre matters more. The genre that we decide that the writer intends. If we think we're reading a poem, we see an image of a small pig in the poem, okay? We're going to think of other small pigs, or maybe large pigs large and small, that we have encountered in other poetic works, right? We're also going to think about the suitability of pigs to, shall we say, the sonnet form and the sonnet content. Do pigs tend to be celebrated in sonnets? I think the answer to that typically would be no, right? What we're not going to do is allow our own personal interest in pigs to, this is as we get better as readers, we're not going to allow our personal feelings about pigs, personal attitudes and knowledge of pigs, attitudes towards and knowledge of pigs, to distract us from what we see as the generic game going on, right? And that's why I say, and it's a continuation, of course, of what Fowler is saying and Sperber and Wilson are saying, so much depends upon genre, does it not? Indeed, as Anise S. Barwashi and Mary Jo Reef argue, and this is taken from the actual discussion question that, frankly, I wish more people had gone after. I think a lot of people stuck with trifles this week, which is fine. That was obviously allowed. Barwashi and Reef argue, Genres structure our perceptions of literary actions, representations, and identifications, and they do so, quote, at almost every level of structure. And here again, there's this insistence that even on a very micro level, you feel the force of genre. Okay, we're gonna see this play out here in a moment. If you walk up to a play with the idea of a comedy or farce in mind, you'll see comedic elements, even if you don't see comedy writ large, right? Which would be a good test case for this claim. And here we're going to get into something that you guys are saying. Brenton is saying. Brenton is arguing, quote, the subtitle of The Cherry Orchard is A Comedy in 4 Acts. So, to Bawarshi and Reeves' point, Brenton continues, this sets the stage. This generic designation sets the stage for how we should perceive actions throughout the play. I thought that was very well said. Certain actions will be seen as comedic. They could have been seen as farcical, perhaps. Of course, farce is a subgenre, have another go with that word, of comedy. Tragedy is a competing genre, right? Certain actions will be seen as comedic. They could have been seen perhaps as farcical, perhaps even as tragic. And we're going to see here in this example chosen by Brenton, this sort of choice between the tragic significance of a small event and a more farcical or comedic one. Here's Brenton speaking about Epikhodov, who has the following lines and directions in the final act. Quote, the aged fierce, in my conclusive opinion, isn't worth mending. This is Epikhodov. His forefathers had better have him. I only envy him. Puts a trunk, here's the stage direction, puts a trunk on the hat box and squashes it. This seems to exemplify, Brenton argues, both the glossary of terms, definition of farce as, quote, broad verbal humor and physical bustle and horseplay, and the Norton's definition of farce as, quote, slapstick or other physical humor. But, Brenton continues, read without the context of comedy, specifically farce, and without the stage direction, in other words, if you don't feel the force of comedy as a genre, you don't feel that you're reading a genre, and you're not sort of obedient, as it were, to this generic designation, this generic kind of compulsion almost, which is, as Brenton has already said, was instituted by the subtitle of the play. This line could be seen, right, as serious and malevolent, since it deals with whether the older fierce is worth helping. Go back to it, the aged fierce, in my conclusive opinion, says Epikhodov, isn't worth mending. So it'd just be left on the stage at the end of the play, and nobody will care, right? The line is juxtaposed with the practical gag, though, of the hat box being squashed, which softens the delivery, right? So it can be seen as a very serious kind of statement that it would be proper to a tragic assessment of someone's fall, so to speak. You could say that fierce falls at the end of the play. But then you have to think about that hat box, which makes us feel that, no, we're really reading a comedy. Brenton continues, perhaps this draws a connection between Epikhodov's reckless speech regarding a human being and his reckless actions towards the luggage, which I thought was a nice afterthought that he had. Another example, let's get into another example of this same sort of moment, right, in which it's a tiny moment. That's what I think makes it especially interesting, right? It's a very small little micro moment in which genre, okay, seems to be exerting its force, right, one way or the other, and compelling us to read the play one way or the other in this moment. Or maybe if we are not sure which genre the play is obedient to, which we are in such moments, right, looking for direction, okay? In either case, genre seems to be the most important element, as opposed to some kind of errant thought we might have about what's going on. Even thinking about the theme itself, the question of whether human beings, for example, are ever not worth mending. Is that Chekhov's theme, right? This sort of hopelessness about human nature, right? Something along those lines maybe is interrupted as we try to solve the more basic and fundamental problem of genre. So here's that other example. And this is one in which violence is done to the human body rather than a hat box. How different may various wielding of Fierce's slapstick in Act 3 and her own parasol at the end of Act 4 appear if we were told that we were reading a peculiarly Russian sort of tragedy, as opposed to what we are told we're reading, a comedy in 4 acts. The Russian tragedy, one in which no character dies, that would be the peculiarity of it, because in tragedy, typically somebody dies. Often, as you know, if you've read Shakespeare tragedy, many people die. Maybe Fierce does die at the end of the play, but you can imagine that you might feel that you're reading oh, this is how the Russians do tragedy. It's not so much that people die, houses die. A house does something more than, but including a family. So it's like a family dies, maybe. A house dies. A kind of whole lineage passes. As Veria exclaims, quote, "Yes, life in this house is over. There will be no more of it." I mean, how are we to take that line? Is that like a tremendously tragic line? Or is that a line in which, well, it's just more silliness, Veria being silly? That is a question, unto itself. But getting back to the violence that we see done in this particular scene, we might still find Veria's violence ridiculous, right? When she hits Lopakin with the stick, or when she brandishes the parasol and he flinches at the very end of the play. But the emphasis, if we feel we're reading a tragedy, even a peculiarly Russian tragedy, might fall on how the stick hurts. Because hurt it does, right? Lopakin reports an immense bump coming up, unless that's just nonsense and extravagance and exaggeration on the part of Lopakin, right? Once again, that's the comic, the comedic genre exerting itself when I ask that question. See what I'm saying? We have to recall this is a man who, as a peasant child, was referred to as ignorant, beaten Yermolai. He received emotional bumps much worse than any physical bumps that he might have received, because the emotional bump is so lasting that he flinches. He flinches when any stick is raised, okay, in his vicinity. And I don't know, I kind of, to the extent that that's what you take away from these micro scenes in which pretty insignificant violence is done to the body of Lopakin, are you not allowing the genre of tragedy to compel your attention in those moments? So much depends upon genre. Yes, indeed. Much depends upon genre, as you agree. Maya on Chekhov. According to a glossary of literary terms, tragedies are dramatic representations of serious actions which eventuate in a disastrous conclusion. A farce, on the other hand, which is a branch of comedy, kind of exaggerated comedy, is designed to provoke the audience to simple, hearty laughter. Now, at first glance, a cherry orchard seems like a tragedy due to the intense sadness of the main character, Lyubov Ranevsky. However, once you remove yourself from your emotional connections to the story, or I would say suspend generic expectations, it is easy to realize every character in the play is crazy. They do not behave like normal, well-balanced, and realistic human beings. No one in the play is making smart decisions or is behaving maturely. There are a handful of moments that change context significantly depending on which genre you are associating the play with. So if you associate it with farce, you're going to emphasize this absence of normal, well-balanced, and realistic behavior. An example of such a moment, Charlotta's speech on identity. Perhaps her most, this is well identified by Maya, where Charlotta is concerned, which she just really doesn't have that many moments that make you think of tragedy, right? But this one moment, when she wonders about her past, where I came from and who I am. I don't know who my parents were. Perhaps they weren't married. I don't know. Right in the middle of this, though, takes a cucumber out of her pocket and eats. I don't know anything. Pause. I do want to talk, but I haven't anybody to talk to. I haven't anybody at all. Now, that's a very sad moment, or it could be. But then you got that cucumber. It's hard to overlook this fact that she eats a cucumber from her pocket during this episode. This is, as Maya argues. So it's very hard to take it seriously. Committed to seeing the play as tragic, we see her cucumber as providing maybe some mere comic relief, as opposed to as an element that undercuts tragedy, which is approaching the drama as a farce. That's what you're perhaps going to see, is you can see the rug pulled out from under the serious moment, right, by the cucumber, which might remind you a little bit of the banana wielded. Speaking of stuff being pulled out from underneath one and one slipping on banana peels, here it's, I guess, cucumber rind. Another such moment, and this is a student from another section who wrote about the scene of Lopakin's betrayal. You will remember this. You consider the play as farce, and you get a complete reframing of that moment because it's a pretty serious moment. Lopakhin, hailing from a line of serfs, I'm quoting from the student at this point, has become rich and now financially has become something of a financial advisor of Lyubov and Gayev, who is Lyubov's brother. You'll notice all these different spellings of the names of the main characters, and that's just the Russian way. Okay, even sometimes inside the play you'll see it. Lopakhin, different translations have different spellings, right? We have 2 or 3 different translations at work, I've noticed. Lopakhin, seeming early on to think only of remedying the family's debt, says he is, quote, delighted to share that he came up with a solution that would mean that the estate will bring in 25,000 rubles of profit every year. Just cut down the cherry trees. That's the way to save the estate. That's the way to save the cherry orchard. Cut it down and build lots that could be leased off for villas, right? Turn it into a kind of resort, right? And the siblings, of course, reject this advice and are just blindly, absurdly, almost humorously optimistic that they will suddenly be able, money will just show up and they'll be able to solve this problem, right? It's almost farcical how confident they are that they will take care of the problem without having to resort to Lopakhin's advice, right? Well, then, of course, the orchard goes for sale just as Lopakhin warned, right? So you see how you're faced with this generic situation. Okay, is this sort of tragic moment when the hand of fate reveals itself against these silly, right? These, well, maybe silly in their expectations, but tragic in their, right, in their hopes and dreams and aspirations. Well, it is revealed at a party that Lopakhin was the buyer. Okay, the same guy who was trying to save the orchard by, of course, cutting down the orchard, is the guy who ends up, he was warning them against himself, if you see what I'm saying. His actions actually surprised everybody. Nobody considered that Lopakhin, someone so close to the family, would swipe the estate out from under them and move along with the plans to cut down the cherry trees. So you can see how this is a moment, right? Well, I'll just read what I wrote. This is where Dubraw's claim of generic expectations shaping the story comes in. How are we to take this event, this little micro episode? Lopakhin's blatant betrayal could be portrayed as tragic, and he could be seen as this villain, right? This sort of antagonist that you might have in a tragedy, right? And someone who is very destructive of the hopes, dreams, aspirations, and hubris of the main character, the hero or heroine. In the context of comedy, on the other hand, all this just seems absurd, and you're just laughing, right? At the silliness of the whole thing, and the absurdity of Lyubov and Gayev, and even Lopakhin, who doesn't, at some level, doesn't even, he's celebrating with them at the end, after he's bought up the orchard, not seeming to realize how this probably looks to them, if you see what I mean. That sort of blindness, again, that's kind of comic at some level. Again, from the perspective of tragedy, Varai, remember the daughter's supplication, subsequent to this event, when she suggests that an unfair and terrible fate has befallen them, she sounds like a character in a tragedy, right? I'm thinking now of some of the responses to this episode beyond Lopakhin's immediate response of unresponsiveness to how this might look to other people. Varia has got a very, really tragic kind of perspective on it, right? Think of how our words would sound if we heard them spoken by Ismene or Antigone. Now, one might point to the equally, potentially at least, tragic moment of Madame Ranevsky's emotional response to the auction of the family's beloved estate. You remember what she says? This is her response. My estate, my beautiful estate, as a student in a different section put it, her nostalgia, her inability to let go of the past, and her tears are often portrayed as symbols of the passing of an era and the inevitable change that accompanies it. And it seems to me that that sort of affect, that sort of emotion that she's displaying in these moments, if we take it seriously, that's the question. If we take it seriously, could be proper to the genre of tragedy. However, as yet another student opines, quote, when approaching the cherry orchard as a farce, we can view Madame Ranevsky's melodramatic outbursts and her failure to take practical steps to prevent the auction, not necessarily, I mean, Lopakhin's advice is not the only advice she gets. There are perhaps some other things that could have been done, right? But we can take her failure to take any practical steps to prevent the auction from coming off. We can see that as absurd. And as this student went on to say, I don't think there's a better word to describe Madame Ranevsky than melodramatic.
okay, which is itself a generic term. Her auction room characterization of her state as beautiful may appear less as a tragic expression of loss, more as a humorous, absurd, silly, kind of farcical exaggeration of her attachment to material wealth and status.
So much depends upon genre, right? So much that, in fact, we may imagine that genres are fixed categories, static categories that don't change, and that the original genre is somehow given to us as though we didn't discover them or construct them ourselves as human beings over the course of whatever civilization, in the history of whatever civilization of which we were a part, that there's these fixed categories that probably transcend civilizations. So you have Chinese tragedies, right? Indian tragedies, you have African tragedies, you have American tragedies, Russian tragedies, right? And it's tragedy is just this category that just won't change. Well, not precisely, right? Not precisely, although the question is very complex. And we're not going to get to the bottom of some of these questions that I'm introducing. The important point is to introduce the questions and get you thinking about some of these topics right now, because I think it's going to make you better English majors, right? So turning to what you had to say, as Chris and Carly agree, The Cherry Orchard, whatever it is, certainly is not simply a comedy. As Chris notes, echoing Joanna's term, some of the social topics are a little too dark, especially the scene where suicide is brought up between Yepahatov and Dunyasha. Michael asserts that, quote, this play has elements of both comedy and tragedy. A reader may perceive The Cherry Orchard as a tragic play with comedic undertones or as a comedic play with dark undertones. I thought that was very well said. Carly introduces the notion of a tragic comedy, or later, as she puts it, comic tragedy, which is discussed, tragic comedy, yes, by Abrams and Harfin, and makes me want to ask you, and this could almost be a discussion question, couldn't it? It's not, but it could be. Does it fit their definition? Does The Cherry Orchard fit the definition offered by Abrams and Harfin of the tragic comedy? Okay. Does it threaten tragedy but end up, this is one of the criteria. Does it threaten tragedy, threaten to become a tragedy, but end up ending happily as the way a comedy would? So that's where we get the tragic comedy, where even tragedy precedes in the term itself, the structure of the term comedy, tragic comedy. So you get a sense of the sequence and the way that it works, although you can imagine it working the other way around, which we want to go back to Carly's notion of the comma tragedy, right? Hey, by the way, is not tragic comedy not so much a threat to the notion of genre, it's just a new genre, one which, introduced, further testifies to the power of genre to structure perceptions, etc. Right? So here's somewhere in the middle. Do you see where we are here? Somewhere in the middle between a hymn of praise of the extraordinary formative power of these fixed and static categories as though they were handed to us by some divinity. Tragedy, comedy, I guess tragic comedy, but that's my whole point here is that tragic comedy seems to have arrived on the scene after tragedy and comedy have come into the realm. It's a more modern mode, okay? There probably are some tragic comedies. You can make the argument that they're tragic comedies further back in the tradition, but it's not a dominant genre, okay, on par with comedy and tragedy back in the Greek scene, right? In the ancients, amongst the ancients, they wrote tragedies and the comedies. They didn't have a category called tragic comedy. When they had their contests, they used to have these contests between these playwrights. They had a contest in tragedy. They did not have a contest in which people entered examples of tragic comedy. That is a more Johnny-come-lately genre, okay? So you can see what it testifies to, does it not? I mean, what I just said, you could say the emergence of tragic comedy as a genre in its own right speaks to the power of genre, right? Because when we get something that falls between two genres, we just come up with a new genre. At the same time, it speaks, does it not, to so it speaks to the staying power of specific genres, right? And the shall we say the power of that very term and concept genre, right? At the same time, it speaks, does it not, to the fact, as I said before, that they really can be mixed, as it were, okay? Although what comes out of the mix between fixed categories that turn out not to be fixed might itself be a genre, if you see what I'm saying. So you kind of get evidence of both possibilities there. The fact that it's not as though genres don't conceivably evolve, that they don't mutate, and that they don't mix and kind of have offspring, as it were. Beautiful children, the beautiful child called tragicomedy, right? Who's a child of tragedy and comedy. At the same time, tragicomedy comes into her own right as a powerful new genre that resists change, and that seems to last over many, many years, okay? If it's a viable, as it were, aesthetic offspring.
Still, don't some works fall outside existing genres? What about trifles? Wait, trifles is a tragedy, isn't it? Sort of? What the heck is it if it's not a tragedy? Well, you guys had a lot to say on this question, and I think you said some good things. Amanda, I fully believe trifles is a tragedy. A once lively woman drained of happiness snaps, right? The tragedy here was allowing Mrs. Wright's spirit to be broken. Tragedy is defined as an event causing suffering, which is what we saw happen in trifles. It may not be a heroic tragedy if we compare it to Antigone, but it is definitely tragic. Alexis, after all, both works deal with death. KCB, Trifles takes on themes of murder and revenge, and as Cahill claims, deep emotional trauma and turmoil. KCG, quote, tragedy often revolves around characters' inability to escape their predicaments, the same predicaments that ultimately define their fate. The question arises, is every work in which an event causing inescapable suffering and death and trauma, every work in which an event causing such things occurs, is it a proper tragedy? Don't epics, for example, have plenty of such events? Nanette, I think that Trifles by Glaspell is a tragedy. According to H&A, a tragedy is a dramatic representation, or tragedies are dramatic representations of serious actions which eventuate in a disastrous conclusion for the protagonist. Many of you quoted that quick and ready definition offered by Harfam and Abrams. Based solely on this definition, Nanette continues, Trifles meets the criteria. In Trifles, an attorney, sheriff, friend, and two wives are in the house of a suspected murderer. There's your dramatic and serious action, which has placed the wife of the murdered man under close examination. But our writers of the glossary also refer to Aristotle's definition of a tragedy, which includes really as much as a supplement as anything correcting the previous definition that was offered. Tragedy includes arousing pity and fear for the tragic hero. In Trifles, the audience gains a sense of fear, Nanette continues, knowing that the only person in the house when Mr. Wright died was probably Mrs. Wright. The pity grows until you find out that Mrs. Wright's only source of company is a canary. Olivia also gets into these questions of tragic emotion or affect. In a glossary of literary terms, Abrams and Harfam say, Aristotle in the first place sets out to account for the undeniable, though remarkable fact that many tragic representations of suffering and defeat leave an audience feeling not depressed but relieved or even exalted. It is difficult to say by the end of the story, a reader would feel relieved knowing how uneasy the ladies are after finding horrific evidence and even more horrific conclusions about what happened to Mrs. Wright. So you can see that Olivia is wondering, on the basis of the emotions prompted by tragedy, typically, okay, or patently, whether we have a tragedy in Trifles, just as Nanette is saying that I think we do, given that we have these emotions that are proper to tragedy and that they are prompted. Here the question arises, okay, and you can tell I'm playing the devil's advocate throughout this panel. Just how serious are the actions and those attendant emotions or affect depicted in Trifles? Do the emotions rise to the level that we expect tragic affect, tragic actions to occupy? Is the fear we have upon Antigone's fatal defiance of Creon, which leads to her own death as well as the deaths of Creon's wife and son, really of the same order as the feeling, exultation, or what have you, that we have upon the women's small rebellion against the law at the end of the play? Is the pity we feel, right? I mean, Antigone's fatal and fateful and momentous defiance of Creon. Do we have the defiance at the end of the law, at the end of Trifles? Are these things really at the same level? This is the question that more skeptical people are going to be asking you about Trifles. Is the pity we feel for Mrs. Wright upon the death of her canary, as Juana said, yeah, we do feel sorry for her, but is that truly of the same order as that feeling that we have for Antigone upon the death of her brother? Right? Think of the events themselves, moving away from the emotions provoked or prompted by the events to the events, the actions themselves. The death of Mr. W, Mr. Right, is obviously not a comic episode, right? But does it rise to the level of seriousness required for tragedy? Jasmine wonders, I thought cogently, whether we have great misfortune, which is what we should have in a tragedy. Do we have that in trifles? Compare with Antigone and the death of Haman, for example. This is just one example of, I think you would agree, a very serious action and a great misfortune. This is the prince of the kingdom who commits suicide, thus interrupting smooth succession. It's hard to think of a more serious action than that. And the whole political infrastructure of the kingdom may be brought down by what has happened during the events of Antigone. And nobody would say that there's anything of that social consequence that's occurring in trifles. You know, compare Antigone's burying her brother and the women, as it were, in trifles, burying or hiding the dead canary. And you get a little bit of a sense of how there might be a mismatch here on this whole question of, well, down below, I'm going to quote Mark, the question of magnitude. How serious are the characters given their social station? Lance offers, quote, while Trifles explores the human condition in difficult situations, the characters are simply not of royal or powerful origin. You know, they're fairly obscure local provincial characters. Now, Nanette pushes back. They do have some importance, she says. And the women especially, the women in the play, are not indifferent to them, as you might think that they would be if these were completely unimportant people, to them or their histories, right? The men are, by contrast, sort of ho-hum. Still, though, are these folks of social consequence in the sense that we have in Antigone? As I said, Mark brings up this question of magnitude, which figures in Abrams and Harpham. And you feel that you need a certain degree of magnitude to be in the company of proper tragedy, right? Classical tragedy. Now, KCB has a solution. Hey, we're not talking necessarily, right? We're not talking here necessarily classical tragedy, proper tragedy, perfect tragedy. Trifles, quote, fits the bill for what is called a domestic tragedy. And several of you took this tack, which I compliment and applaud. Domestic tragedy, this is right from Abrams and Harford, which is defined as a, quote, protagonist from the middle or lower social ranks who suffers a commonplace or domestic disaster, which seems to fit this play. Elijah, Trifles, is maybe a more indirect tragedy. Jocelyn, Trifles does not exude the same tragic sense to the readers we get from Antigone, for example. But it doesn't seem to fit into any other genre. So, you know, it's not a comedy. It's not a farce. It's not a tragic comedy. It's not this, that, or the other. So I suppose it's a dramatic work, so we can't say it's a narrative. So I suppose we can say that Trifles is a tragedy due to the best fit. But, you know, Jocelyn, I can tell, is not very comfortable with that. And I get it. Mark, after all, genres aren't really set in stone. So maybe this could represent some kind of an evolution in tragedy that we could get. As I think we're going to be saying about perhaps a play that might remind you of this play with respect to the domestic focus of a tragedy, Death of a Salesman, which is coming up at the end of the week. Now, with respect to classical or proper tragedy, however, back to that question, whether it is classical or proper tragedy, and maybe still the new question, which is maybe it's some new evolution of tragedy, still in view at this point, right? An even more fundamental question is asked by Maya in response to Sarli. Quote, in Antigone, the main character has great misfortune befall her and ultimately loses her life. On the other hand, the character with all the misfortune in Trifles is Mrs. Wright. Now, a number of you noticed this. And Mrs. Wright never actually appears in the play. As Juana says, she's only mentioned throughout the story. She's never a part of it. Back to Maya, who says she's discussed throughout the entire play. She never physically appears. Thus, it's difficult to classify her as the main character. Jocelyn has questions about who the protagonist is. Casey says you could say Mrs. Hale is the protagonist, moving the story along, pushing the narrative in her speculations. And Mark and Jocelyn seem to agree with that assessment. But here's the question. Can a play be classified? And I think it's a question that you're all asking at the same time. Can a play be classified as a tragedy? And I mean a tragedy of any kind. Domestic, okay, domestic tragedy. Can it be called an indirect tragedy, as Elijah wanted to call it, right? Is it, what sort of tragedy do you have when the main character who is suffering all the misfortune is really essentially not the main character? Doesn't even appear on stage. Is not really a character in the play. Think of it this way. When you're casting this play, right, you don't have to find somebody to play Mrs. Wright. She never shows up in the play. What kind of a tragedy do we have when we have the the figure, the character associated with tragic action is the person who is inspiring all the pity and the fear and all the rest, and whose actions are the ones who are in question, right? And whose fate is the one which is in question when she's not on the stage. Can you have tragedy? And that strikes me as a very good question to ask. Moreover, get this. Now, here's my again. We don't even know if Mrs. Wright has a disastrous end. Okay, the action is not the actions. Now, what she acts, how she acts, that becomes pretty clear. But the consequences, those actions that beget actions, right? The fate that befalls the tragic actor, which is itself an action and part of the larger action constituted by the entire play. This play ends prematurely. We don't know what happens, right? It's fully possible, as Maya says, that she will be fully acquitted. Jocelyn adds, we cannot say if a disastrous conclusion was reached for the so-called protagonist. Mark opines that, hey, maybe the preface to the story is tragic. That's something that is not depicted in the play. And note how, as someone did, I didn't put your name here, but you know who you are, how the mystery genre at times seems to the fore, the mystery of what even happens, as well as why it did. Here, this would take us pretty far away from tragedy, and we'd be closer to something like, Dorothy Sayers or Agatha Christie, right? The premise being that tragedies don't read along as if they are detective stories. Now, Sarli offered, to me, both stories are not only tragedies in their own right, but they have this dilemma of moral obligation that we're used to finding in tragedy. And this certainly came out in our discussions of Antigone, right, from last week. Antigone feels obligated to have a proper burial for her brother, right? And the problem is the king's moral obligation to the throne. And trifles the question is whether Mrs. Wright had the right to take her husband's life, and if Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, who were conflicted, did they do the right thing in refusing to turn in Mrs. Wright? Sarli, here's a question for you. Does the question arise whether Mrs. Wright was right to murder her husband over the canary and the rest? Does it ever come up, really? Is anybody really wondering whether she was right to do it? Don't even the women know that that wasn't a good action for her to perform? The question is, do they have enough sympathy for her? Do they have sympathy for her, and do they have enough sympathy for her to feel that, look, the proper thing to happen next, okay, maybe even the right thing at some obscure level of morality. We're not going to worry ourselves too much about the finer points of morality. At some level, the proper thing to happen next, the best thing to happen next, certainly is not this. For Mrs. Wright to be hung, executed for the killing her husband, right? When you look at the larger context of what has just occurred. Okay. Now, I agree that the other issue does arise, whether the women were right to conceal the murder or right to allow the men to overlook it in their arrogance. Right? That question perhaps does arise. So in other words, not the question of whether Mrs. Wright was right, but the question of whether the women were right. And maybe I just answered that in what I just said a few seconds ago. Here, too, the events of the play seem to fall far short of the level, well, no, this is a new idea. Don't the events of the play seem to fall far short of the level of seriousness, moral and social, spiritual, and even political, that we have in Sophocles? Glaspell's women are, after all, trying, I'm thinking of, Mrs. Hale, right? And, her accomplice there at the end. Are they not trying in one unpremeditated moment? This is a thing of the moment, what happens here, right? When they act so as to save a neighborhood woman from facing the summary by-the-book justice of the local, blunt, arrogant law, which can be counted on to be blunt, unfeeling, and blind to the complexities of marriage women such as themselves face every day. So they kind of act on impulse and do what they do, right? Again, I want to suggest that, you don't get moral deliberation going on in the play. You know what I'm saying? The way that you do in Antigone, where you have the chorus and Antigone are going back and forth in this philosophical discussion, this intense moral, spiritual, philosophical discussion they're having about what she has done. And both Tiresias and the chorus talk to Creon in the exact same way. So you really have this huge moral issue being worried, right? This is a little bit different. I was looking around, casting about for an analogy in Antigone for what I see the women having done at the end of Trifles, and I came up with this. It would be as if if you had in Antigone what you have in Trifles at the end. It would be as if Ismene, for example, suddenly got courageous enough to hide Antigone's tracks, right? When Antigone buries her brother. It'd be something like that. Compare that to like what Antigone does. You know what I'm saying? Would she have done it? Is the action itself massive enough to rise to the level of seriousness that we expect of tragic action, right? Where what Ismene does in that moment that she hides Antigone's tracks, that is supposed to be the tragic action, the huge action undertaken. Of course, all kinds of things come to mind, right? If this were to fit in as a good analogy, fit analogically with Trifles, Ismene would not get in any trouble for doing it either. Is that the sort of thing you would expect in a tragedy, right? That's what the play is all about, instead of what we get in Antigone. And the other question, even more fundamental, would Ismene be doing it, what she did, covering up the tracks of Antigone so as perhaps to prevent Antigone being arrested, and implicated in this crime of burying her brother, right? Would she have done it out of a sense of moral obligation precisely? That's what would make this analogical. It would be something that she did under some momentary emotional imperative rather than a carefully considered and calculated moral obligation. So in that sense as well, I don't quite think we have what we expect to have in a tragedy when we look closely at the details of this play. Now, De Mola wrote, Trifles doesn't follow the classic structure of a tragic hero's fall. It's more a commentary on gender dynamics and social neglect than an exploration of fate and moral duty, as we see in Antigone. It leans more towards a social critique. And I think this is an interesting reaction to the play as well. Just completely remove it from the register of tragedy, okay? Maybe even really, you're getting close to removing it from almost the register of the aesthetic. It ends up becoming kind of a political work, right? And Jasmine is kind of moving in this direction, not necessarily the political, when she wonders whether it doesn't come across as an historical fiction. Okay, it's really set in this specific place and time, right? I realize that this could happen during several decades of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Still, you get the feeling we're looking at a provincial American marriage here out in the countryside, right? And it's American. And it might be a little bit different, the play that we get if this happened in Germany in the 17th century. So I get where Jasmine's deriving this term historical. Another person wrote, this is from another section, quote, this story goes into the darkness women often deal with regarding men. Is not that darkness, okay, which we might expect to be productive, when you follow the women into that darkness, you might expect it if this were an Antigone level tragedy, you might expect that darkness to prompt fear and pity and all these grand emotions, these exalted emotions that you, in this general exaltation of emotion that you're supposed to get with tragedy, right? But this darkness, isn't it the sense of darkness that you get, isn't it a kind of moral, social darkness, maybe even political with respect to gender politics, that the men are just in the dark? Okay, their blindness is not this blindness that we associate with, like metaphysical, mysterious, irremediably metaphysical blindness of the tragic actor who cannot see what's in store for him. And it's like Oedipus is just, Oedipus actually goes blind, right? Blinds himself. But the whole idea is he's been blind throughout his play, right? He hasn't been able to see the consequences and the significances of his actions. And somehow that seems like the human condition writ large. I don't know that you get that same sense from this play. Instead, you get the idea of like some local, bureaucrats, as it were, local people of the community just being staid and stolid and a little too confident that they can see things and they're missing things, right? And you get the feeling it's very remediable, that the men could be taught in a way that Oedipus cannot be taught. The men could be taught to, right, not to make these mistakes. The problem with tragedy is whatever lessons you get, they always come too late and they come at too great a cost. You can't really go forward, and grow from them. You're kind of shattered by them if you're the tragic hero. Tragedy points to a darkness that cannot be enlightened. It can only be wondered at, okay? This inescapable human condition. And I wonder if Glaspell doesn't hope, by contrast, to enlighten and hope to change. If so, she believes that women's fate, as laid out in Trifles, is indeed changeable. It can be corrected, it can be improved, right? And I don't know if you could say the same about Sophocles' sense of the fate of his particular woman, Antigone. And doesn't that make Antigone, a play, a bit more social and political, a bit too social and political for a tragedy, closer to being a work of social criticism?
Okay, then, so Trifles maybe occupies not the space of an existing genre, but seems to point at something, I don't know, perhaps clearing space for some future genre, conceivably, itself a, metaphorically speaking, genetic mutation away from tragedy, which you see even in some of the decisions made by Glaspell, for example, chiefly that of moving tragic action off stage and placing us at a point outside of such action, beyond such action, where much of the significance of that action is still to be determined, right? It's not immediately present. There are all kinds of ways in which, in fact, we don't have what Aristotle seemed to think was required for a tragedy, and that again could be a nice little discussion question, but that's a good example of the kind of discussion question that would be better if this were a course on Renaissance tragedy, as opposed to a course which is all about an introduction to literature, right? So once again, there's certain topics that are just exceedingly interesting, probably to you as well as they are to me, that are not our proper focus because they just require that we go into too much detail in certain directions. It takes us away from the center line of what we're doing in the class, which has to do in this moment with genre, right? So let's offer something of a generalization at this point. Genres are in motion. They're not static. They're not static. They're stable now. They're not wavering all over the place, are they? We don't have these genres mutating wildly in any number of different directions over time, right? But I repeat, they're not static. They are mutable, okay? And I want to introduce a new concept here because it's an idea that we'll be employing. They're also modal, right? Now, what do we mean by that? We're going to get into Fowler here in a moment, not just to explain what one might mean by modal, but to confirm some of the points that we've just made. So let's just begin with Fowler, and I'll come back to this notion of mode here in a moment, which is something that we'll be employing down the road of the course. This is what Fowler has to say. Considering genres as families, by the way, Fowler's writing about himself. Can you imagine that? In this book, so when Fowler shows up, he's talking about himself. Considering genres as families, as Fowler did, Fowler notes, made it possible, even obligatory, to adopt a diachronic historical approach, and so offered a fresh approach to the problem of historical change. For Fowler, the so-called fixed historical kinds are not at all fixed but mutable, continually renewed repertoires of characteristic features, external structure, rhetoric, topics, and the like, right? And I underline that statement because it struck me as important. For Fowler, and perhaps for us, the so-called fixed historical kinds, comedy, tragedy, perhaps tragic comedy, right? And we can get outside of genre thus considered, and talk about lyric, narrative, which is a kind of a different register of genre that we don't need to go into the differences right now, right? But narrative, lyric, and dramatic. And within dramatic, of course, we have comedy and tragedy, right? But for Fowler, the so-called fixed historical kinds, comedy, tragedy, narrative, lyric, all the rest, are not at all fixed. They're immutable. They are continually renewed repertoires of characteristic features, external structure, rhetoric, topics, and the like. For example, rhetoric in Antigone, you have the chorus speaking in a certain way that you don't have Creon speaking, right? And you have Antigone lamenting. You have like the lamentation over the death of the brother, which is a characteristic rhetorical trope that we find in Greek tragedy. External structure has to do with, we could go through some of the details there, but I think maybe you'd be good at naming them yourselves, right? External structure would have to do with the fact that we have a political situation, Crayon. You have those in a lot of these. A lot of the Greek tragedies have, it's an affair of state that is at issue, right, in the story, the external structure, the social structure. It's a big cultural or social episode that is at the center of these, right, and that might even be fall more under the issue of topic. External structure might have to do with, like, even the sequence of, you remember Freytag's pyramid, where we have an exposition, then we have rising action, and we have a climax, which, denouement and all that stuff, right? Falling action and the denouement. What we have in tragedy, of course, is, for example, according to Aristotle, the recognition, anagnoresis, right, was the Greek term. We also have the scene of suffering, right? So we have all these conventions, hamartia, right, and hubris, the tragic flaw, and the tragic pride, which is at the heart of so many tragedies, right? These are those characteristic features that are continually renewed, and the repertoire is continually renewed, as tragedy makes its way through the tradition, okay, according to Fowler. And the renewal itself is a sign of mutability, okay, of the fixed historical kind known as the genre, because we do have little changes that you can see, for example, as you just go down the history of, like, Senecan tragedy, revenge tragedy, all the different tragedies, Roman tragedy, you arrive at Shakespearean tragedy, make your way into more modern tragedy, and you see that it's still recognizable as tragedy, but it's not that there has not been no change, okay, in the kind. Now, he goes on to say, such repertoires are not a means of classification so much as a source of signs and a language or coding system that allows economical yet intelligible communication. Quote, change of the repertoires is continual, for new works signify precisely by their modulating of specific previous states of the genre. Hence, their own addition to it modifies the existing state, and a series of such successive changes may alter it almost out of recognition. Yeah, I'm not going to argue with Fowler, except to say that to the extent that it gets altered out of recognition, don't we have a different genre at that point? And maybe that's his point, is that, to the extent that it's not out of recognition, even if it comes close to being out of recognition, you can tell there that you still have tragedy, and it still deserves that term with a big T even, right? Which testifies once again to the power, though not, immutable and static, the power of genre, just as it exhibits this kind of power, what we call staying power, right? It just lasts. And he has more to say, and I've got some other stuff underlined down below, but I think this micro lecture is almost becoming a macro lecture at this point. Let me just read the last sentence. Throughout kinds of literature, the last underlined sentence, throughout kinds of literature, that's Fowler's own book. Throughout, I should say, kinds of literature represents, quote, genre as a continually dynamic metamorphosis, whereby in the course of history, kinds are assembled, become more consciously practiced, form the basis of modes, enter into temporary mixtures, hybrids, and modulations, and combined to form new kinds. And that's where this idea of the mode comes in to play that I mentioned above. Told you I'd tell you something about. May wait till next time to talk more about this, because we're going to be talking about chorus, the chorus for next week. And we're going to be talking about how the chorus moves from a kind of feature of the genre, right, one of those characteristic features, to, it's still there as a feature, when we get to Chekhov, when we get to perhaps even trifles, we see that we don't have some sort of form of the chorus. That'll be one of your questions, something related to that question. If we do we not have some sort of form, some sort of, successive change, to quote Fowler? Yes, we'll have signs of successive change in the chorus, but we still have something that's not altered completely out of recognition. It still looks a little bit like a chorus, still sounds a little bit like a chorus. Do we not have that as we move forward? Okay, and as tragedy, shows that indeed it's not immutable because it mutates, right? And you wonder whether that's not this thing that he's calling the mode, right? When you have a particular feature of a genre that seems to wander into some space outside of the genre where you don't have a recognizable tragedy anymore, But we have what's called the tragic mode showing up in a play that would seem to be of a different genre or of an indeterminate genre. And this is something we'll be talking a little bit about as we go through and go forward. I mean, as you can see, Fowler here thinks that, in fact, new genres sometimes come out of these wandering modes, which are, of course, little pieces, little portions of the repertoire, of the tragic repertoire, right? And little portions of the repertoire, certain elements of the repertoire kind of become mobile and wander out beyond the existing genre into their own space. A drama gets formed around them, so to speak, and before you know it, when enough people find this very compelling, we have a new genre, right? And maybe a couple of different modes wander out of, maybe you could see this even with tragic comedy, that it's like certain portions of tragedy, portions of the repertoire, certain elements of the repertoire of comedy, wander, mix, we get tragic comedy. Okay, well, that's enough for today. Didn't go back to what I promised you last time. Broken promise then? I don't know. I don't know that you can lose a lot of sleep over this, but didn't go back to Matthew Arnold. I was intending to do that, but I just felt that, no, just get directly to the business of the day, and, we can come back to that on some future occasion. I think you did a very nice job on the whole question of the humanities. So it's a topic that I'm pretty happy with right now. So in any event, keep your eyes open for the new granular modular schedule that will be showing up. As you know, those tend to show up on Friday. And get the reading done. It will have the reading listed. And I will talk to you again next week. And of course, you'll have discussion board questions beginning to show up on Friday. So have a good weekend. Bye-bye.